Okay, the second part of this unit is not going to be chapter 17. We're not going to go in order. We're doing 16, the lymphatic system, and then 19, the respiratory system, because 17 is digestive and 18 is nutrition, and they go together. So, excuse me. So anyway, we're going to look at the respiratory system today. Mostly today, we're just going to look at the anatomy of the respiratory system, and then we'll look at a lot of the functional aspects next time. But as far as numbers of organs are concerned, you know, well, I shouldn't say numbers. The organs of the respiratory system you're probably more familiar with initially than those of the lymphatic system. That's not to say the respiratory system is an easy chapter, especially when you get into uh, the mechanisms of it. Get to be pretty hairy at times. But anyway, but today we're going to just focus on the anatomy. But this is the organ system that allows oxygen from the air you breathe to get into your blood and CO2 from your blood to get into the air. So it's involved in what we call ventilation and external respiration, which is the movement of the gases in and out of the body. Um, when we look at the system, we have an upper respiratory tract, and then in the thorax is the lower respiratory tract. You can see the organs here, and so we're going to run through these organs today on this picture. In the upper respiratory tract, that starts with the nostrils. We're not going to really say anything about the nostrils much, but behind the nostrils is a very large area called the nasal cavity. You know, don't think nostrils and nasal cavity are the same thing. They're not. The nasal cavity is the area above the roof of the mouth. So we'll look at that area. And then we'll move on into this area is called the pharynx. Pharynx. It's not pharynx. See, it's Y-N-X, not N-Y-X. So it's not pharynx. It's pharynx, right? But there's three parts of it. We'll see that as we go through. And then from there, the air moves through the larynx, not larynx, larynx, which is your voice box, into your trachea. Okay, and now we're in the thoracic cavity. The trachea is going to split into the bronchi, which split and split, and they branch and branch and branch until ultimately you get into tiny little air sacs in your lungs, and that's where the gas exchange will take place. Okay. So when we look at these organs one at a time, the nose leads to the nostrils, all right, and then behind the nostrils would be the nasal cavity. In A&P 1, when you studied the skull and you looked into the nasal area of the skull, do you recall there were three shelves that came laterally towards the middle part? And they're called nasal conchae. The upper one is part of the ethmoid bone. The other two are parts of the maxilla bone. But anyway, these are shelves on each side of the nasal cavity that are covered by a mucous membrane. And so because of that, they can protect you. That's one of your first lines of defense that we talked about a little while ago. But they can trap foreign things because of the mucus. Also, these mucous membranes are very vascular, so there's a lot of blood flow through them. That means there's a lot of warmth to the area, and they're very moist. So as that air moves through the nasal cavity, it's warmed, it's moistened, and it's filtered before it has a chance to get down into your lungs. If you breathe through your mouth all the time rather than through your nose, you don't get that benefit. The air is too dry. It needs to be moist as it gets down into your lungs. You know, not wet, but moist. And the mucous membranes help with that. The mucus that the mucous membranes produce can help trap foreign particles like pathogens. Then that mucus, you swallow it. This sounds gross, but you just swallow it, and your digestive enzymes might kill those pathogens. You know, so that's a second line of defense. So, okay. Then connected to your nasal cavity are some openings that lead to spaces within some of your facial bones, and those are called your sinuses. You've all heard of sinuses, but they're just openings in some of the bones in your head. But they connect directly to the nasal cavity, and so the mucous membrane that is lining the nasal cavity continues on into the sinus and lines that. If you have an upper respiratory infection of those mucous membranes, it could move into the sinuses, and because it's infected, it's going to get inflamed and produce even more of the mucus, and sometimes that mucus builds up in the sinus cavities and causes a lot of pressure, which is like a sinus headache. That's the pressure resulting from a sinus infection. Some people, you hear about some people having small sinuses, then that pressure is more evident if it's small. And they may struggle with sinus infections more easily. It may not be able to drain as well. But you have these air-filled spaces, these sinuses. They're in some specific bones of the face. You can see the bones here. You have maxillary sinuses. You have frontal sinus, ethmoid, and sphenoid. The ethmoid and sphenoid are between the eyes and back behind there. The purpose of a sinus, though, the big purpose of it is to reduce the weight of the skull, so your head's not so heavy. Okay. Some vertebrates have sinuses spaces in all of their bones. Can you think of a vertebrate that would need a very lightweight skeleton? Birds of flight have sinuses in all of their bones. It just reduces the weight of the skeleton. But it also helps with, it's not a big deal, but it helps with your voice resonance. You know, if you've got a cold and everything's all blocked up there, your voice sounds a little different, like mine right now. But anyway. All right, then I'll come to the pharynx in a minute. Here you can see some views of the various sinuses. This view on the left, this one is showing the maxillary sinuses. So if you have a sinus headache, if it hurts, you know, if you go to the doctor sometimes and you've got this upper respiratory infection, they start tapping on your face, under your eye. All right, they're checking to see if that's painful. And if it is, that's an indication that those sinuses are infected. And then you can see the frontal sinus there. And then the ethmoid and sphenoid. This is showing the ethmoid bone, but it's basically in between your eyes. If it's hurting in between your eyes, or if it's real deep back in there, it's sphenoid. But just be able to name the bones that these facial sinuses are in. Okay. And here's some other views, X-ray views. It shows, like I like the picture on the right because it's showing you ethmoid, sphenoid, frontal, and then this one is showing maxillary sinus. Okay. So here you can see the nasal cavity and the nasal conchae. So those are the shelves, superior, medial, and inferior nasal conchae. So the air is going to flow across all of that in warm, moist, and filtered. And now it moves into your pharynx. The pharynx, that's basically another name for your throat. Okay? But you've got three regions of it. You have a nasopharynx, an oropharynx, and a laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is this part that's above the roof of the mouth, right before you get to the nasal cavity. The oropharynx, when you open your mouth and look at your throat, you're looking at your oropharynx. It's behind the oral cavity. And then the laryngopharynx is behind your larynx, or the voice box. Okay? So, nope, that's wrong. Naso, that's an N. Nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. Okay? In your notes are the tonsils discussed, where it talks about pharynx. I know I have it in digestive system. We'll see some of these as digestive organs too, because your oral cavity and the pharynx, you know, especially the pharynx, you know, food moves through that, but so does air. Okay. But anyway, so we'll see some of this again when we do the next unit. But you hear about your tonsils, and we talked about your tonsils as lymphatic organs. When somebody has a tonsillectomy, these are the ones that are being removed. They're in the oropharynx on either side. Those are the ones, if you still have your tonsils, when you open your mouth, you see them at the sides. Those are the uh, the palatine tonsils is what they're called. And then you also have some tonsils that are up in the wall of the nasopharynx. Those are called the pharyngeal tonsils. If they get inflamed, they enlarge. And sometimes when somebody has a tonsillectomy, you say, "Oh, I'm gonna get my tonsils taken out, but also my adenoids." The pharyngeal tonsils are called adenoids when they get inflamed. Right. But you see, if they got infected and inflamed and enlarged, that could interfere with breathing, as could also with the palatine tonsils, and that could interfere with swallowing, couldn't it? All right, and then the lingual tonsils are these. They're right there on the surface of the tongue. If I don't have tonsils in your notes, don't worry about it for this test. We'll see this area again in the digestive system, and I'll have them listed there. Okay. All right. So now the air's coming this way, and then it's going to move into the larynx and down into the trachea. Okay, behind all of that, right here is the esophagus, and air is not supposed to move there. The esophagus tends to stay pretty closed up. Air easily can move this way, like this. Okay, food does not move that way into the trachea because when you swallow, the larynx moves up against this structure called the epiglottis. It moves up against it to block off the flow into the trachea. That's why you can't breathe and swallow at the same time. Okay, take your hand and put it on your upper neck and swallow. You'll feel your larynx move up. Feel it? And so it's moving up against this part of the larynx called the epiglottis, which we're fixing to look at. Okay, so here you see the nasal cavity. So you see the nasal conchae, and then what part of the pharynx is this? Nasopharynx. This little part right there, that's the opening into the eustachian tube that goes to the middle ear cavity. And then here is the oropharynx, and then right here is the laryngopharynx. And then the next organ we're going to see is this one, which is your larynx or voice box. Okay. Here you can see the mucous membrane. Notice the type of epithelium that is there. Can anybody name it? Okay, I'm going to stop this recording and start back in a moment. My battery's going out.